How we doing, everyone? This is Dr. B. In celebration of Filipino American History Month, which is in the month of October, we're going to talk about a little known piece of California history. I'm referring to the Watsonville Riots. The Watsonville Riots happened in 1930. They started on January 19th and they ran for 5 days. It's an incredible amount of violence against Filipino farm laborers. Around 500 white men basically go through the town of Watsonville hunting Filipinos. Before I get into the details of the Watsonville riots, let's talk a little bit about Filipino immigration here to the United States. The Philippines at one time was completely sovereign and independent. This was the case all the way up until the Spanish invasion. When the Spanish lost the territory to the United States, Filipinos became U.S. nationals. So basically it was a situation like this. You had one colonizer come into the Philippines, take over territories that didn't belong to them, and you had another colonizer, the U.S., took over these territories. Well, this results in a lot of immigration to Hawaii or the Hawaiian Islands. A lot of Filipinos go there to work on the sugar plantations, the pineapple plantations as well. They're viewed as exploitive labor. They're paid very little. They're considered to be docile as well. Hardworking people who basically do the work that they're asked to do and they accept very little pay. In other words, they're easily exploited. They're even referred to as our little brown brothers. And so from there, you also see a lot of Filipino immigration here to the United States. They work, of course, as farm laborers. And here in the state of California, the majority of your farm laborers initially are Filipinos. While the Immigration Acts of 1917 and 1924 were meant to keep Asians from immigrating to the United States, because Filipinos were American nationals, they were allowed to relocate here in large numbers. They worked alongside Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans as well in the San Joaquin Valley, in places like Watsonville and Gilroy in the Bay Area. Most of the Filipinos who arrive here, though, are very young, they're single and male. Only 1 out of 14 Filipinos who come to the United States are female. So Filipino Americans are really the dominant Asian American labor force here in the state of California for the next couple of decades. So Filipino laborers are incredibly sought after by agribusiness because these people are willing to work in incredibly harsh conditions. They're harvesting lettuce and asparagus, again, here in the Central Valley, also in areas like Watsonville and Gilroy. And they work long hours for very little pay. Again, they're referred to as our little brown brothers because they're considered to be docile. They don't complain. So at this time, you have around 30,000 Filipino laborers who are doing all this hard work to pick the food that white Americans are eating. So even though Filipinos are being exploited, they end up doing really well here in the United States. They save their money, they start to own businesses, they begin to assimilate to the American way of life. And because most Filipinos who do come to the US are men, they start to date people outside of their ethnic group. So you see a lot of Filipinos who are dating white women. Now here in 2022, that's not very controversial, but over 100 years ago, it is incredibly controversial and it raises all these white fears that these Filipino men are taking these white women. And of course, we're talking about the peak of white supremacy here in the United States. And this creates all kinds of tension between the Filipino American community and white Americans who see Filipinos as being this invading force, taking American jobs. These people aren't real Americans. There's all kinds of anti-Filipino sentiment that is beginning to spread. And this starts to not just stir up emotions in people. What you start to see is a lot of violence towards Filipino Americans. So as Filipino men are seen dating white women in public, this begins to create a major problem. And so you see a lot of violence and attacks on Filipinos in towns like Stockton, Fresno, Exeter, and Dinuba. And much of it is due to, again, the white supremacy, this attitude towards people of color that, white folks are superior. Again, they're looking at Filipinos as this inferior group of people who are taking American jobs. So prior to the riots in 1930, you had a situation that happened in October of 1929. So this is a couple of months before the Watsonville Riots. So in Exeter, California, this is a small town not too far from where I live, here in the San Joaquin Valley. There was a carnival that took place, and you had some Filipino men who took their white girlfriends to the carnival. And at this carnival, they were being heckled by these white men, and a fight breaks out, and a white man is stabbed by a Filipino. Well, after this happened, around 300 white men, including the police chief, a white supremacist named C.E. Joyner, and these 300 rioters went to a ranch known to hire Filipinos and basically burned a barn down. And so you had this mass exodus from the Exeter area by Filipinos who ended up going to Visalia and Fresno and other places in California to flee the violence. So let's get to the Watsonville riots. So a couple months later, there's two white girls that are discovered to be living with a Filipino man. Now, it doesn't matter that one of the white girls is actually engaged to this man. It just continues to stoke the hatred and the anger that white men have towards Filipino men. And this is what leads up to the Watsonville riots. So close to midnight on January 18th, a group of about 500 rioters gather around a Filipino nightclub. This Filipino nightclub is located in the Palm Beach section of Watsonville. It's owned by a Filipino man. And you see a lot of Filipinos, they take their white girlfriends to go to this place to have a good time. Well, these white men basically threaten to burn down this nightclub. And this is where the violence ensues. So for the next 5 days, Filipinos are hunted basically like animals. So you have Filipinos who are dragged out of their houses, physically beaten. In some cases, some of these Filipino men are taken to a nearby bridge and thrown over this bridge. So we're talking about incredible amounts of violence. There's one Filipino man who loses his life. He's 22 years old. His name is Fermin Tobera. He's shot through the heart. He's killed. His body is later flown back to the Philippines. He's considered to be a martyr, an icon for justice and equality. So for, again, 5 straight days, you see incredible violence against the Filipino population. Basically, there's this attempt to drive Filipinos out of the area. This violence spreads to other locations as well. It spreads to San Francisco, to San Jose, to Stockton. There's all kinds of anti-Asian sentiment, specifically towards Filipino people. And wherever Filipinos go at this time, their lives are really in danger. So many Filipinos end up leaving the country. California also outlaws marriage between Filipinos and white women. The United States, the federal government, with the Tidings McDuffie Act, also restricts Filipino immigration, I think, to about 50 Filipinos a year. And so after this time, you really don't see a lot of Filipinos being allowed to immigrate to the United States. But there's still a lot of Filipinos who work in the fields. They work alongside Mexicans and Mexican Americans. They are involved in a lot of the strikes here in California. There's a lot of history in regards to Filipinos that we're just not taught. So it takes 81 years, but on September 4th, 2011, California finally officially apologizes to Filipino Americans for this incredible violence that they endured during this time period. So there's an assemblyman, his name is Luis Alejo. He's the one that authors the resolution. He writes, Filipino Americans have a proud history of hard work and perseverance. California, however, does not have a proud history regarding its treatment of Filipino Americans. For these past injustices, it's time that we recognize the pain and suffering this community has endured. This is a piece of history that happened right here in California. When I was growing up, I didn't learn anything about any type of racial injustice towards Filipino Americans or any Asians for that matter. And that's one of the problems that we have in our education system is there's all this history that's been buried. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe, like, and share. Happy Filipino American History Month. Until next time, later.